Right. So you can also stream us on YouTube if you really want to take a look at us instead of just hearing us. You can also stream us on Facebook. And if you miss any part of this show, you could always revisit it on kuw.org, or you can go to the Week in Review podcast. Okay, let's get to our first story. A King County inquest jury has concluded that 2 Seattle police officers used reasonable or justifiable force when they shot and killed Charleena Lyles in 2017. Charleena was a pregnant Black woman and a mother of 4. Erica, I want to start with you. Can you give us the background on what happened on the day that she was killed?
Yeah, Charleena Lyles was, as you said, a pregnant mother of 4 who was in her apartment when she called 911 to report a burglary at her apartment that she said had happened sometime before. 2 police officers, Jason Anderson and Stephen McNew, showed up, and they, according to their account of events, which is what we have, they began taking a report, walking around the apartment with her, and when her demeanor changed, and she began acting, again, in their account, threateningly towards them. Before they showed up at her house, they knew that she had called and had exhibited signs of mental health issues and been in a mental health crisis with officers in the past, just 2 weeks before, in fact. But it's unclear to what extent they took that into account. In any event, she at some point pulled out a small paring knife. And the officers said that they felt threatened by her, that she lunged at them, and they shot her 7 times, killing her in her kitchen. And 3 of her children were in the apartment at the time, and they were sort of quickly ushered out by police and put in the care of neighbors. So those are just kind of the basic facts as we understand them of what happened.
Thank you. And I want to talk about what an inquest is, and how did the inquest process change recently? Knute, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, the inquest process is kind of technical. It's not like an actual trial. Evidence is presented to a jury that is then given a set of instructions as to certain findings that will then determine whether or not shooting, for example, was justified or not. They rarely find for victims, partly because the laws are written in such a way that there's a lot of flexibility on the part of the police to respond with force. The process has been tweaked, but I think this particular finding shows that it is not necessarily a place where people will find justice.
So another thing to consider, and this is something that actually you brought up, Erica, which is that Charleena had a history of mental illness, and her family said that she was going through a mental crisis that day. Amanda, if I can go to you on this one, how does that factor into the decisions that the officers made that day?
I guess what I've read about it is, I'm not really sure how to answer this question. I think when I was reading about this, a lot of what I thought about is how, mental health and response and first responders has come up a lot recently. And, a lot of the reason people say that we need to reimagine public safety is because police officers are not always trained to deal with these situations. They might not have the resources, even if they do have a crisis responder hired by the department, they might not be available. And then also, there's more emphasis on de-escalation techniques. And something I've been wondering is sort of, what was an alternative response here? Was there de-escalation that they could have employed? One thing that I was paying attention to while reading was also the whole discussion over the use of a taser. My understanding is one of the officers requested a taser during this incident. There wasn't one available, partially, I think because it wasn't charged and he didn't have it on his person. But then what I found really interesting is that apparently the jury in this inquest said unanimously that a taser wouldn't have been appropriate because it was like it was like a small apartment. But then I guess my question to follow that is, if not a taser, what else could have been used that wasn't lethal?
Right. One thing that I find actually fascinating is that we have a community feedback club, by the way, which is a way we ask listeners to weigh in on certain things. And we asked our listeners through this community feedback club this question: how do you think police departments could update their policies to improve how they handle scenarios with people experiencing mental health crises? And here's what some of them had to say. We had Holly and Kent, Rebecca in Seattle, Margaret and Everett, and Irene and Kenmore all suggested mental health professionals should accompany police officers on calls that may involve a person experiencing a mental health crisis. However, here's the fascinating thing. We got a comment from a social worker on the SPD's crisis response team. So I would love to get your reactions to what he said. He said the crisis response program has been operating since 2010. We respond with uniformed officers to active 911 crisis calls and do post-crisis follow-up. We often accompany officers to calls that involve weapons and or violence, but if a scene is too dynamic, unsafe, we do not have the training to effectively intervene until the scene is made safe by officers. I do not know of any social workers who are equipped to safely intervene in these situations, and I fear that there is an existing assumption that social workers have magic de-escalation abilities, with the thought that social workers can manage dangerous situations. I do, however, sincerely believe that there's a wide variety of scenarios where social workers could be utilized to handle a specific subset of crises calls, which SPD currently responds to. And he mentions a couple of programs like the Kahoot program and the Denver Star already operate, and he says that he believes that Seattle could implement programs like these. Any reaction to that?
Well, I think to put this in context, this was not technically a crisis call initially. So, I think that the situation that the officers were dealing with was more something that, maybe it's possible that it could have been identified as a crisis call in some way, but it was a burglary call. And I think the question is, whether there were de-escalation tactics that the officers could have used, and if, they could have done something differently beyond, shooting this woman 7 times in her apartment when she was holding a paring knife. Again, we only have the officer's version of events here. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. They say and testified that she, lunged at one of them with this little knife. But there were other sort of signs that she was in a mental health crisis, and there was information that they had available to them beforehand. The reason that she was in a mental health crisis, according to her family, was that it was triggered by domestic abuse. And none of that sort of came up at the inquest itself, but it's important context that the officers could have considered. I'm not an expert obviously in the de-escalation training, but it seems just looking at the face of it and even looking at the officer's version of events that this was a lot of force used against someone who was clearly, in the middle of going through something, and armed with the paring knife, but they had an open door behind them. And so I think there's an open question about whether they could have done something differently.
So what does that mean for this going forward? Prosecutor's office, anything like that? What happens next?
Well, the prosecutor's office has said they're going to make a determination as to whether to file criminal charges. So that's kind of the next step. It's pretty unlikely, but it's possible. So that's the next step going forward. After that, Bruce Harrell, mayor, has said that he wants to really look at whether the situation could have been handled differently. Essentially, the issues I was talking about, the training stuff. So he's saying, could there be more, yet more reforms and yet more trainings? I think that's going to be really unsatisfactory to people who, are in the activist community and the advocacy community, who say that, we've been trying reform and training for a really long time and it hasn't produced different results.
Right. And one of the things that really kind of gets lost, I think, sometimes in a story like this is how people are affected by a tragedy like this. How do they move on? I just want to play a quick thing here. This is Katrina Johnson, Charleena Lyles' cousin, talking about the experience of the inquest. What was that like?
It was very painful. And I don't know where my family goes from here. I don't know how we begin to pick up the pieces after this process.
that's something that I really think about, is just how do you move on, and what do you do next? I just want to acknowledge the tragedy of this, and how it affects Charleena's family. One other thing here, I mentioned the Feedback Community Club. Some additional comments that we got. We had Frank in Vashon Island, Shannon in North Seattle, Suna and Olympia all mentioned prioritizing the use of tasers, but as Amanda told us, testimony, I guess, was there that maybe a taser wouldn't have been effective. But also Samuel and Leanne in Tacoma and Linda in Issaquah all expressed doubt that reform was possible and suggested defunding or disbanding. So final thoughts here from anyone, really. I just want to know your reaction to somebody says, this is nothing is going to change. It's just almost hopeless. I feel like a sense of a loss of hope about reform. Anything that you're hearing out there about that?
About that comment from the social worker, I do feel like often when we talk about, first response in situations like this, there's sort of this false dichotomy of like, okay, they know immediately whether it's like a mental health crisis or if it's like a violent safety situation. But the reality is that most 911 dispatchers have I think it's 90 seconds or something to make a determination on whether to call fire or police. And that's pretty much the two options they have. But if you talk to most first responders, most of them have a situation in mind where they thought the situation was safe, and then something happened and it made it feel different. And I think this just all shows that when it comes to first response, we have to imagine people more holistically. It's not just mental health or safety. These things are often intertwined, and I think first responders have to be more equipped to deal with these dynamic situations.
Yeah. Knute, anything else on this before we leave?
Well, obviously, I think there's a bigger societal problem. The institution of the police, is a reflection of larger society. So there's some really big issues that we need to deal with there in terms of what we consider good policing, what we consider acceptable. And that is, I think, a tough thing that all of us in the city and people across the country are wrestling with. How do you find some kind of balance? And can you find that? I also want to just go to the mental health thing. Clearly, the family in this case are victims as well of this event. And, hopefully they will be able to access something to help them with their anger and their grief, to help them deal with the trauma. But I think the kind of largely unspoken thing is police officers themselves are dealing with trauma on, an almost daily basis. And there's a culture among police of not getting counseling, not getting help with their own PTSD or, whatever they're dealing with. And I sometimes think that in some of these reactive situations, it often, comes back to the officers involved and how clearly they're thinking, or the kinds of challenges that they're dealing with on a daily basis that they need help with. Yeah. So, I just think there's sort of a whole lot of threads here.
Yeah, well put. So by the way, for the folks listening, the Community Feedback Club as I said, is a texting club that you can opt into. All you need to do is just go to kuw.org/feedback to sign up. And if you do sign up, we'll just send you periodic texts asking for feedback or story ideas. Okay, we're going to take a quick break here, and we'll be right back talking about the disproportional influence the Catholic doctrine has on our healthcare system in Washington.
You are listening to Week in Review on 94.9 KUOW, Seattle's NPR news station. It's 12:21, sunny and 70 degrees in Seattle.
Australian rapper Tasman Keith talks about family, identity, and his album, A Colour Undone.
It's really just our way of, I guess, speaking our opinion and changing what needs to be changed through music.
That's this afternoon on All Things Considered from NPR News.
All Things Considered airs today from 3 to 6:30 p.m. on 94.9 KUOW, Seattle.
Support for KUOW comes from the Muckleshoot Indian Tribe. For more than 165 years, the Muckleshoot Tribe has worked to uphold and protect the sovereignty, treaty rights, and heritage of Seattle's First People. More at wearemuckleshoot.org.
Welcome back to the Week in Review. I'm Zaki Hamid. I'm in for Bill Radke, and today I'm joined by Crosscut and KCTS9 editor-at-large Knute Berger, Publicola publisher and editor Erica Barnett, and the Seattle Times breaking news and enterprise reporter Amanda Zhou. So when we think of Seattle, we don't really associate ourselves with the Catholic Church, but Naomi Ishisaka from the Seattle Times wrote this week that a surprising amount of abortion access in our state is under the control of the Catholic Church. In an article titled, "Even in Liberal Washington, the Catholic Church has too much influence on abortion access," Naomi Ishisaka concludes that having the right to abortion does not mean you have access to it. So, Amanda, I want to start with you here. This seems to be happening because of hospital mergers. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it seems what's happening is that, maybe you have a secular hospital group and then you have one that's affiliated with the Catholic Church. They merge, and then all of a sudden the services being offered changes. So I think in the column, Naomi wrote about how some systems aren't offering elective abortions anymore. And I think one of them clarified that, we'll offer it in cases where the mother or person who's pregnant, if their life is endangered, we'll perform it. And then another organization, I think this was Swedish, they faced criticism and then ended up partnering with Planned Parenthood to underwrite abortion coverage. But it all goes to show that I think the point of her column was that, legally abortion is protected here in Washington, but access is a different system and is a different story.
Yeah. Erica, you've been actually talking about this for a while now, but it doesn't seem that people have paid much attention to this story. So how did so many of our hospital beds come under the control of Catholic doctrine, and what are the implications of that?
Yeah, well, as Amanda said, I mean, it's just been a process of mergers that have been sort of continually approved. I worked for a couple of years at a pro-choice organization, NARAL, and and this was when I was a comms person, and one of the things that I was just constantly trying to get people to pay attention to was this mergers issue. I mean, we as an organization, because it's been going on for many years. I just kind of, in prepping for this for the show, I looked up some old stories. I mean, this was something the New York Times was sounding the alarm about 10 years ago. And it's never stopped. So as of before the most recent set of mergers, 41% of hospitals in Washington state were run under Catholic doctrine. And what that means is that, essentially the Catholic bishops, a group of men affiliate, in the church, determine what the policy is based not on medical need, but based on religious doctrine. So in practice, that means, not just that so-called elective abortions, which the Catholic Church is defining as, those that are for reasons other than saving a person's life, are not allowed. But it also, bans things like medical aid in dying, death with dignity is not allowed, birth control, especially things like IUDs, miscarriage management. And if you go in and you're having a miscarriage, they have to decide whether, are you really in danger of dying, or can you go home for a while and experience that alone. So it's been a problem for a really, really long time. I'm really glad that Naomi Ishisaka brought this up, but it's not a new issue, and it's not one that the state has really done anything about. In fact, this very legislation that would have introduced just new reporting requirements about mergers never even made it to a committee. So there's never been any urgency about it, and there isn't really now.
And I think, Knute, do you know the percentages of Catholics in Washington? Is this really
17%?
17%
self-identify, according to the Pew study, which studies religious habits of every state. And so the dominance of Catholic medicine in comparison to the number of Catholics. Now, we know that not all Catholics are anti-abortion. Many of them are pro-choice. If you add evangelical Christians, That's another 25% of the population, probably the largest single group other than just people who identify as Christian generally. And of course, it's interesting because Washington is particularly unchurched. And we have one of the largest percentages of people who don't identify with any religion, 32%. That's the biggest single number in the state. And the Northwest and the Northeast, particularly New England, are famous for the number of religious skeptics there. And it's interesting what Erica's saying, is that this thing has been sort of quietly happening over time, and people watching it have been very concerned about it. But I think with this Supreme Court decision versus Roe, there's sort of a new awakening. I remember when Dino Rossi, Republican, ran for governor, and he was anti-abortion and said when he was asked, well, Roe is settled law, I couldn't do anything about it. Well, now we're finding that Roe isn't settled law, and it's all getting thrown back to the states. So I think Erica's point about the approval of these mergers and the fact that medicine should be dictated by science and not theology, I think is incredibly important.
Do you see any changes going forward? Or, I mean, is there going to be a renewed urgency to address this in the legislature, for example?
I mean, there's a lot of jurisprudence that says, that these mergers are incredibly hard to prevent. But, I think there is room for legislation, certainly around the fact that some of these, institutions, a lot of these institutions are publicly funded in part. But, I think as with so many things, on the state and local levels to protect abortion rights and to protect other types of rights that are threatened now, the time to act was 20 years ago. And when we're looking at, Washington state, it isn't just that 40 to 50% of institutions of hospitals are controlled by the Catholic Church. It's also that in a lot of counties, there are no institutions that are not, there are no hospitals that aren't Catholic controlled. And so, in Seattle, we do have, one of the arguments is, well, you can just choose a different hospital. In Seattle, we do have choice. Although I would say, if you're calling an ambulance for a miscarriage, that's gone, to the point where you need to get to the emergency room, you don't really have that much of a choice. But this is a huge problem in rural areas. And I'm not optimistic that there's a lot that can be done now because these mergers have already taken place.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else from anybody on this before we move on to our next one?
Oh, just really quickly, I think the so-called right to die aspect is also really important. I have a family member who had a catastrophic medical emergency and was taken to a Catholic hospital. She had a signed directive saying that she wanted life support pulled if she was in that state, and they refused to do it. And when you're dealing in a situation like that, where you're already traumatized in terms of the family member and the decision that needs to be made and carrying out their legal wishes, and having opposition to that at that moment, it was exceptionally cruel. And I think that's another important piece of this that was touched on. I just get kind of speechless about it.
Don't we have a law though about end of life care? So I'm wondering, can the hospital supersede that, or am I wrong?
Well, we do have the right to die. That's a particular law that pertains to terminal patients who choose to enter that program. Most hospitals will abide by signed documents. It's the kind of thing, it's a different version of what Erica was talking about in terms of thinking ahead. That if you're in that kind of a situation, how do you want to be treated? And in my experience, or from what I've heard, mostly those are followed. The event I'm talking about occurred in a different state. So, I'm not sure what the law was there.
Yeah. Amanda, anything else on this?
I guess one of the things I wasn't aware of until I moved here is that I guess like the Department of Health is aware of this in that they say that they'll cover your abortion even if your personal insurance plan doesn't. But I guess, it's different that, the DOH saying we'll cover it versus like our patients being told that when they're not being offered an abortion. Like, are they being walked through the process of, you have a right to have this paid for? I think it all comes down to patient access and whether people can navigate the system.
Mm-hmm. Okay, it's definitely a surprising thing, even though folks like Erica have been talking about this for a while now, but now it's coming back into the forefront. We're going to switch gears a little bit here and talk about the flu pandemic in 1918. Knute, you wrote this article in Crosscut this week, saying that when the current pandemic hit in 2020, there were lots of comparisons to the 1918 flu pandemic. And you talk about the reactionary period that followed the flu pandemic. And it has lots of similarities to some extreme reactions we're seeing right now. And, I'm not talking about the parties about the roaring 20s and all that. What I really found fascinating about your article is that the extreme movements against immigration, white supremacist movements, extreme politics. So give us a little bit of history here. Describe what happened. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the 1918 so-called pandemic, which lasted into the early 1920s, and the COVID-19 are not exactly parallel, but there's a lot of historical rhyming going on. The 1920s, I mean, we, like you said, we tend to think of the jazz age and this period of kind of exuberance and wild dealings on Wall Street, but it was really a period, when you look at it, where there was a tremendous political reaction to modernity. And you saw the Ku Klux Klan had its second, its resurgence, which, began in the teens, but just really blossomed in the 20s. And it was almost entirely in the North and the West. It was centered in the Midwest and the far West. Literally millions of Americans joined the Klan, and they were promoting Americanism, anti-immigration, anti-Catholic. There was a whole series of things, and they took over state legislatures and towns all over the place, including in Washington and Oregon. So at the same time, you had this real backlash in terms of immigration. You had here in Washington, we had anti-Japanese laws went into effect in the early 1920s. 1924, it was a Washington congressman who sponsored the immigration bill that basically banned all Asians. He called it a bulwark against alien blood. And not only did it pass and become national law, but it was highly popular both with the Klan and with the general public. You had a resurgence of eugenics-oriented laws that allowed forced sterilization of people who were dubbed to be, determined to be threats to society because they were, pregnant, poor Black women, and for other reasons too. So I think it was a period where World War I had a big traumatic effect on the country. The pandemic, both of which had sort of, people had seen a kind of intervention by government that they had never seen before. In World War I, there was rationing, there was a draft, there were very tough laws that came in terms of what you could say about the government without being thrown in jail for treason. And then the pandemic, which was mostly enforced at a local level, but there was resistance to masks, frustration with public health, and that kind of thing. And so I think there was maybe people were kind of groomed for rebellion, and you saw Republicans sweep into office, both in the state and nationally, very conservative Republican presidents on the idea of a return to normalcy, normalcy being, the 1880s.
So yeah, so we're seeing some of these things happen now. I'm wondering, for Erica or Amanda, if you see contrasts between that kind of backlash in the 20s and today's backlash.
Well, I mean, I think, one difference, I mean, as Knute said, it's a rhyming situation. It's not parallel. I mean, one difference, of course, is that we're now a globalized society. So, both the pandemic itself and, reactionary politics are not contained to a region or, even a country. I think to bring it to local politics and again, not to say these are comparable things, but I think that one thing that we're seeing on the local level in every area across the United States is that we have a lot of things that happened because of the pandemic, including the decline of businesses, small businesses, downtowns, the increase in visible homelessness, attrition from police departments, things that that are directly pandemic related in many cases, being sort of blamed on people that are not responsible for them. And I would say in Seattle, we've seen the homeless people blamed for a rise in crime, the decline of downtown, the fact that businesses are boarded up. And we've also seen, again, just locally, and not to say this is comparable to what happened in the 1920s, but, a sort of revisionism about policing and an almost kind of worshipful approach to police, that we went from, defund the police very briefly in 2020 to we need to fund the police and fund them more at all costs and to do anything we can in our power to increase the size of the police force. And I'm saying that is what local government policy is right now. So it is a mini backlash, and I think it has put some of the wrong people or turned some of the wrong people into targets, including people who are living unsheltered. So that's the parallel that I see locally. But I don't know, maybe there are better parallels at the national level that Knute or Amanda could point to.
Yeah, Amanda, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I often have a hard time with these kind of questions comparing it to, another era, which, as Erica pointed out, we weren't a globalized society, we were isolated in 2020, but we still had the internet, for better or for worse. But, it's a different experience. And I wonder how people in the 1920s weathered isolation from the pandemic versus how they weathered it today. I do feel like there is sort of sometimes this call for like a back to normal, right? Like I feel like Joe Biden kind of like ran on that platform as like, I'll be boring, I promise. But I think it's important to ask, what there's always this like hearkening to like the good old days. And maybe that's what people are seeing like 2019 and 2018 is now. But I don't know, I think it's always worth questioning, who was actually benefiting during that time period.
Well, I got to say, I do think it is a fascinating article, and there are some of those similarities that I'm seeing now with extreme movements that I think maybe we should kind of pay attention to. But it's on Crosscut. Everybody, you should go and read that. So we're going to take a quick break here, and then we're going to come back and talk about the Harrell administration's new program with removing encampments from sidewalks.
94.9 KUOW, Seattle's NPR news station. It's 12:41. Sunny and 72 degrees in Seattle. Our forecast says it's going to be sunny and warm the next few days.
President Biden and his team are thinking, we are told, about lifting some of those Trump-era tariffs. People who work in customs and logistics are prepping their teams too.
I had to tell them, please don't be so efficient. Please clear the shipments that are coming from China a little bit closer to the actual arrival time.
I'm Kai Rizdal. Tariff Talks next time on Marketplace.
Today at 2:30 and 6:30 p.m. on 94.9 KUOW.
Welcome back to Week in Review. I'm Zaki Hamid. I'm in for Bill Radke, and today I'm joined by Crosscut and KCTS 9 editor-at-large Knute Berger, Publicola publisher and editor Erica Barnett, and the Seattle Times general assignment reporter Amanda Zhou. Erica, you wrote this article this week, and I want to talk about it a little bit here. You wrote that Mayor Harrell's Strategic Initiatives Director Tim Burgess sent a memo to King County Regional Homelessness Authority Director Mark Dones titled "A New Approach to Tent Encampments on Sidewalks and Other Transportation Rights of Way." In the memo, the new administration outlined a zero-tolerance strategy toward people living on sidewalks, in which campers that remain will be given only 2 hours' notice to leave. And you also mentioned that there's a scoring system that allocates scores to encampments based on a set of criteria, including violent incidents, fires, proximity to parks or children, and sidewalk obstructions. So there's a lot there, but tell us a little bit more about what you found.
Yeah, so it is kind of two stories there, but I think they are very much related. The sidewalk strategy, I want to say up front, was never implemented in the form that it was drafted, but you described it, and that's exactly what it would have done. Enabled the city to say that a tent or an encampment is an obstruction. It's got to be out of there in 2 hours, and we're going to use police to enforce that. What they ended up doing, and I don't know the current status of this strategy, except that it isn't in place. What they ended up doing was implementing a separate policy downtown that is called the King County Regional Homelessness Authority and the city are doing jointly, that is called the Partnership for Zero meaning zero unsheltered homeless people in downtown Seattle, through trying to shelter people and provide them services and theoretically housing. But I do think that scuttled strategy informs the other part of the story, which is that the mayor's office did go forward with the plan of assigning points to various situations and encampments. And if you get enough points, the encampment is swept. This is something that the city, this is a so-called database strategy, and it's something that the city has tried to do in the past. During past administrations, this is not the first go-round for this kind of thing. And it's really, really difficult because, they assign points based on things like, was a fire reported? How many RVs are there? How many tents are there? Was there, a shooting? Was it fatal? And there are issues with all of those things that, and I would say they may or may not mean that an encampment is more dangerous or more of a concern or more of an obstruction. So I think there's no perfect system. And I think pretending that there is through, something that looks like data is always going to be pretty problematic.
Does anyone, Amanda, Knute, do you think that this scoring system, is this an improvement over what we have now? Is there merit to it?
I guess I appreciate that there's more transparency about what they consider to prioritize for a sweep, because I think especially among, even people who are housed, but especially among people who are homeless, there's such a perception that sweeps happen arbitrarily. There's no, when do they happen? How long does it happen after a notice? Like, there's just so much confusion there. So I feel like having some information of like, oh yes, like the mayor does care if there's been like a shooting is helpful. I think what I took away from reading this is that Mayor Bruce Harrell really is zeroing in on visible homelessness or homelessness that, has reported metrics with it, like fires. Because, there are a lot of people who live unhoused, but don't live in visible areas. And, I wonder, like, how do they get access to services if, like, they don't end up on this scoring system because they're not blocking a business or because no one has reported a fire or that there's a large amount of trash.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Knute, anything to add to that? I'm wondering. Well, let me just get your reaction first.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can understand why you might want to have something that was a little more quantitative in terms of how you're making decisions. And obviously, if there's a particular public safety concern, that might get a higher priority. But these things can be extremely arbitrary. It's of course it doesn't address the issue about, well, if you sweep them, where do they go?
Right.
if they're really that much trouble, what neighborhood are they going to go to? So there's still this huge elephant in the room, which is housing. The other thing that I just have a kind of an instinctive negative reaction to is any program that has zero tolerance. We're human. We live in a complex society. You're never going to get, everything to zero. And I know that's kind of an aspirational thing, but it also to me suggests an attitude that is not necessarily realistic.
Yeah.
Well, I also just quickly on the issue of transparency, I should add that, this story was based on a records request. I've asked the Harrell administration, as have many other reporters, what their criteria are many, many, many times. And the administration has actually treated it like it's proprietary. So the documents that I got, are only transparent in the sense that they provided them in response to records requests, and I published them on my website. But I think the Harrell administration has actually been kind of secretive about this. Not suggesting there's anything nefarious there, but they have not been transparent. And just quickly to Knute's point, I do think there is a debate in this city that is kind of an eternal debate about where do we want homeless people to go, because we're sure not going to provide them with enough housing. That's never been something we've done. What a radical idea. And the question really is, do we want them to be invisible in places like the jungle, which was cleared under the Murray administration, or do we want them to be visible where, theoretically we can offer them services and shelter? It's been kind of back and forth. And I think a policy of zero tolerance or just sweeping people once they reach a certain number of points to like, let them all go back to the jungle or someplace like that. And I think that's a likely result if we don't actually invest in housing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's one thing that kind of, I heard Mark Doan speak one time as executive director of the Regional Homeless Authority. And I remember one thing that really stuck with me when he was talking about just not only about their approach to all of it, but really what the solution is. And he goes, I'll leave you with just these words. It's all about money. And that's it. And that always kind of stuck with me. Okay, we're going to actually squeeze one more story here. And we only have a kind of a few minutes for that. But I think it's an important story to kind of address. Since the pandemic began, Seattle's school enrollment has been plummeting. In fact, in the fall, the district expects the smallest number of students it's seen in the last 7 years, according to district projections. And that will lead to staffing changes and the amount of funding that a school gets. So I guess my question is, what is the short-term and long-term impact of this drop in enrollment? Anybody can take this one.
Well, the short-term impact is some schools are going to lose a lot of funding. Your funding is based on how many students you're serving, largely based on student enrollment numbers. There are probably a lot of reasons why this is happening, but I do think the pandemic is part of it. People having made a decision to make a change as to where, whether the kids are going to be schooled from home or not, or what, alternative groups. I have 2 grandchildren in Seattle public schools, and, the masking or not masking policies, there hasn't been a lot of enforcement or transparency about COVID rates at schools and that kind of thing. And I know parents get, particularly the phase that we're in, very concerned about safety and health. And if you have the option of going to another school that might have stricter behavior or whatever, that may seem to be an option. So it seems to be very much of the moment, but I'm not an expert. So
yeah, and I think that's what's kind of fascinating. I think, Amanda, you pointed out actually in an earlier email when we're just kind of corresponding that the enrollment drop is in wealthier neighborhoods. So I find that actually fascinating because some people have opted, for private schools. So if it is in part due to COVID, what are private schools offering that public schools aren't? Why are, parents taking their children out of these and going to private school if they can afford it?
Well, I do not have kids, so I cannot speak fully to this decision. But I mean, no surprise to anyone, parents want the best for their kids. But in our current education system where wealthier families who have access to homeschooling or private schools, kind of it creates this, I've been calling it sort of like the nice white parents problem, which is that, I thought it was interesting that the story points out that it's not Seattle's poorest school districts that are impacted by this. And it's also not really high schools. It's mostly that kindergarten and I think elementary age students in places where, there are parents who have made a choice to put their kids in public school and clearly could afford to also find another option. But I imagine it has a lot to do with perception of masking, having control as a parent in the school, maybe pedagogical decisions on how they're teaching, remote versus virtual, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm wondering what happens to people living in these wealthy neighborhoods or districts, but they can't afford to go to either homeschooling or a private school, but they still live in these neighborhoods, but they can't afford that. I'm wondering if these are the people that are mostly affected by this.
One of the things the article points out is staffing changes. Staffing changes happen regularly for districts, but it's sort of more dramatic this year because of the drop of enrollment. So I imagine that must be one way that these schools are really feeling the change.
Yeah. Erica, anything on this?
Yeah, I'm curious what the sort of long-term impact is going to be. The article, and I also don't have kids, so don't have a direct stake in these decisions, but I'm curious, if there is going to be a long-term sort of decline in enrollment, what the impact that is going to have on the school district's budget. Right now, they are still kind of being supplemented to some extent by COVID relief dollars. But, I also think that sometimes these things do resolve themselves on their own, looking at the fact that it's mostly very young children who have not been able to be vaccinated, who have been, sort of pulled out of kindergarten. Washington State doesn't have compulsory schooling until age 8. So I can see people with the privilege and the ability to make that decision doing that because they don't want their kids to get sick. It's also possible that one reason for enrolling kids in private schools, if you can afford to, is, there's maybe more consistency. I mean, there's been a lot of kind of debate about policies at Seattle Public Schools, changing and parents not always knowing what the policy is and what they're going to be responsible for doing. And I can see that as a parent, you might want a little more predictability in knowing, your kid's going to go to school at a certain time and school's not going to end, abruptly, or you have hours change, things like that. But this is kind of the exact the perfect example of a wait and see story, because I think we're looking at a very small period of time and without a lot of ability to predict what's going to happen in 4 or 5 years, both budget wise and enrollment wise.
Yeah. Knute, anything else on this?
I was just going to say, one of my grandkids is in kindergarten at a neighborhood public school in a neighborhood that has a lot of well-to-do people in it, and a lot of them send their kids to public school. Mm-hmm. So it may be a percentage thing, but there are plenty of people with resources and whatnot who are sending their kids to public school, particularly on the young end.
Right. Yeah. I have an 8-year-old, almost 9. So she's going to be going into 3rd grade. And we live in Shoreline, though, not in Seattle. But I remember when she was going into kindergarten, we were just really, really hoping that she's going to get into her neighborhood school and not, someone far away. And we had to wait and see. There was waiting lists and all that. And this year, now they sent out that they're opening it up to other neighborhoods if they want to opt into that. So you can, we really felt that, the drop in enrollment is not just for Seattle schools, it is regional. Okay, folks, we just have, about 3 minutes or so here to the end of the show, and which is great. We have a little bit of time to talk about what's making us smile this week and what we're looking forward to. I certainly have a few things that are making me smile, but I want to know about you. So what's making you smile? Let's start with Amanda.
I've been enjoying the good weather. Knock on wood. Don't tell anyone I said that because the moment I say it's going to turn terrible. But yeah, I've really enjoyed being able to finally pull out my shorts and eat lunch outside. And I've really also enjoyed being able to bike after work and get to explore the bike network we have here around Puget Sound.
Nice. Summer is maybe finally here. Erica, what's making you smile?
Yeah, similarly. I have a pea patch in the city's pea patch program. I actually just recently moved to a very desirable pea patch that actually has sun. So I have been out in the garden constantly, and that's kind of what my weekend looks like, digging up potatoes and planting stuff, and hopefully keeping the pea patch people off my butt, because they tend to get vocal when my stuff gets a little out of control. So sorry guys. I'm getting on it, I swear.
Pea patch, that's awesome. And sun, that makes a huge difference. Knute, what's making you smile, buddy?
Well, this is a story that Amanda wrote about that made me smile, was the changing of the name of Harney Channel in the San Juan Islands between Shaw and Orcas to Caillou Channel, named after one of the first elected indigenous representatives in Washington. And Harney, William Harney, general who it was named after, was not only key to almost instigating war with Great Britain during the Pig War, but he was a monster. And I'm just delighted that that change was made. Very appropriate.
Excellent. I'll tell you, one of the things that's really making me smile is the Well Reign. They are making me smile because that's our women's soccer team. If somebody doesn't know, not only will they take on the hated Portland Thorns on Sunday in a fierce rivalry game, but we can remind the Thorns and all of their fans that we have a Presidential Medal of Freedom recipient on our team, and they don't. And of course, I'm talking about the great Megan Rapinoe, who was at the White House this week for the honor. Also, the Seattle Sounders take on the Portland Timbers on Saturday. So it's a rivalry weekend, and I am so here for it. Go Sounders, go Reign. All right. That's it for our show today. Thank you for listening to the Weekend Review. Our panelists today are Crosscut and KCTS 9 editor at large Knute Berger, Publicola publisher and editor Erica Barnett, and Seattle Times general assignment reporter Amanda Zhou. Our show is produced by Kevin Kniested. And of course, on the boards is the dancing destroyer Bernard Ouellette. Thank you so much for doing this. And thank you all for listening. Please be kind to each other and have a wonderful day, everybody.
This is
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. That was awesome.
Yeah. Thanks for having us.
Nice meeting you all.
Nice meeting you too. I don't think we met before, Amanda. But
no, I don't think so. Yeah, it's great to share the space with you. And you too, Zaki.
I can't hear.
Happy potato hunting.
Yeah, thank you.
Happy biking.
Have a good weekend.
Soccer.
Thank you guys.
Bye.